Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Amy Myers, for those I haven't had the pleasure to meet over the last years. I'm the director of the Yale Center for British Art, which is my great honor, and I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's conversation between Courtney J. Martin, who is Deputy Director and Chief Curator of Dia Art Foundation, who received her doctorate in the history of art from Yale in 2009, and the distinguished artist Howardena Pindell, who received her MFA from the Yale School of Art in 1967. We are delighted to join Courtney in recognizing Ms. Pindell, whose artistic practice and decades of teaching have influenced so many contemporary artists, as well as the wider world of museum goers in so many important ways. Those of us at the Center wish to thank all of our partners in the production of this very special event. The Yale Alumni Art League and the Yale Alumni Association, here represented by Nicholas Lewis and by alumna Mikko McGinty. The university's president, Peter Salovey, and his wife, Professor Marta Moret, who also are alumni of the graduate programs at Yale, and Sandra Vitale from the President's House, who has offered her very special assistance to my own excellent colleagues here who plan our special events. We thank the Yale University Art Gallery, whose collections include Howardena Pindell's work, and we recognize the support of the Yale School of Art, which is nearing its 150th anniversary. We are especially grateful to Dean Marta Kuzma and the art students at Yale today for their enthusiasm for tonight's program. Additionally, we thank the historic Afro-American Cultural Center at Yale and Dean Riza Nelson. We all are the proud co-sponsors of this evening's conversation. Courtney Martin, who will serve as our moderator this evening, is a renowned scholar of modern and contemporary art. Before assuming her position at Dia, Courtney served as an assistant professor in the history of art at Brown and at Vanderbilt, a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the history of art at the University of California, Berkeley, a fellow at the Getty Research Institute, and a Henry Moore Institute Research Fellow. She also worked in Media Arts and Culture Unit of the Ford Foundation. Her research interests have resulted in exhibitions and publications on the work of a broad range of artists, from Frank Bowling, Rob Ryman, and Kader Attia, to Ed Ruscha and Yinka Shonibare. From 2018 to 2015, she co-led a research project on the art critic Lawrence Alloway at the Getty Research Institute, and she served as the co-editor of Lawrence Alloway Critic and Curator, which won the 2016 Historians of British Art Book Award. She also served as the editor of Four Generations, the Joyner Guifrida collection of abstract art published in 2016. This year, she has been responsible for exhibitions of work by Mary Corse, Nancy Holt, Dorothea Rockburn, Blinky Palmero, Keith Saunier, and Andy Warhol at Dia. Courtney received her doctorate from Yale for her research on 20th century British art, and she has had many ties to the center over the years and is one of our closest and most valued intellectual partners. It is my great pleasure to welcome her back to the center and to the podium to introduce our very distinguished guest, Howardena Pindell. Courtney.
Thank you very much, Amy. It is my great pleasure, actually, to be here. It is one of my favorite places in the whole world, in fact. I'm also so pleased to be here with Howardena Pindell. I'm going to keep this introduction incredibly brief so that we can have more time to actually talk to Howardena, which is why we're all here. And I also want to remind you, though, that there is a longer piece of information about Howardena in the handout that you might have received at the front. Born in 1943 in Philadelphia, Howardena studied painting, first at Boston University, before coming to Yale to enter the MFA program, from which she matriculated in 1967. After leaving Yale, she moved to New York, where she embarked upon her professional career as an artist, while also working as a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. Since 1979, she has taught at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. This year, she enjoyed a critically acclaimed retrospective entitled What Remains to Be Seen at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, then traveling on to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and it will have its final stop at the Rose Museum at Brandeis University. This is an amazing exhibition, and I hope that we all get a chance to see it. Completed in 1980, Free, White, and 21 is one of Howardena's most significant works, but it is also, and perhaps more importantly, a seminal contribution to post-minimalist art production. We will watch the film before we commence the talk this evening, but please, I remind you that it is about 12 minutes long so that you get to really enjoy the entirety of it before we begin talking. Thank you so much.
When my mother grew up in Ohio, her mother would bring in various babysitters. There were about 10 children in the family. And one of the babysitters happened to be white. My mother was the darkest of the 10 children, so that when this woman saw my mother's skin, she thought she was dirty and took lye and washed her in lye. As a result of this, my mother has burn marks on her arm. Okay. When I was in kindergarten, I had a teacher who was not very fond of black students. There were very few of us, possibly 2, in the kindergarten class out of a class of perhaps 40. During the afternoon hours, we were given a time to sleep. Each of us had our own cot, and we were told that if we had to go to the bathroom, we should raise our hands, and one of the teachers would take us to the bathroom. I raised my hand, and my teacher flew into a rage, yelling, "I can't stand these people," and took out sheets and tied me down to the bed. She left me there for a couple of hours, and then finally released me. One of the students filed a complaint, perhaps to a parent who did not know that I was black. Perhaps the child did not know or had not learned to differentiate race at that time. I later found out that that teacher was fired for bothering a student. Perhaps I was not the first one. I went to a high school in Philadelphia which was for girls, which emphasized academic achievement. Everyone was very competitive with one another for grades. I did very well in the history classes and asked that my history teacher put me in the accelerated class. She told me she would be happy with my grades to put me in the accelerated level. However, she felt that a white student with lower grades would go further. Therefore, she would not put me in the accelerated course. You know, you really must be paranoid. Those things never happened to me. I don't know anyone who's had those things happen to them. But then, of course, they're free, white, and 21, so they wouldn't have that kind of experience. I went to Boston University, and for my first year, I lived in a dormitory. I was entered as a freshman student in January. I had been very active in high school running for various offices, so I decided to run for an office in Boston University within my dormitory. The office that they had available was one where you would act as a liaison with other universities. You would act as a liaison with MIT or with Harvard or Radcliffe. I did whatever was necessary to get my name on the ballot, and just before the vote was to be taken, my house mother brought me into a meeting with the other officers of the House, all members of Boston University's student community. And I was informed that my name was being removed from the ballot because they felt that my being black, and if I, of course, won, I would be highly inappropriate for that office. Oh, you ungrateful little, after all we've done for you. When I graduated from graduate school, I proceeded to look for a job because I had not been able to find a job. Although I had applied at 500 schools for teaching positions, I received approximately 500 rejections. So I decided to come to New York and go door to door looking for any kind of job. Someone suggested that I try Time Life and to apply for a job as a picture researcher. I went to the Time Life building, and the personnel office was willing to see me because they saw that I had Yale University on my application, that I had graduated from Yale University. While I was waiting to be interviewed, I was sitting in the front office, and a number of women came in looking for secretarial positions. The white women that came in looking for secretarial positions were told to fill out an application, and they were told that after they turned in the application, they would be notified if a position came available, and that, you know, if they were interested in their qualifications. Any non-white woman who walked in, Hispanic women or black women, I did not see any Asian women come in looking for jobs at the time, were told that there were no positions available. They were not given applications. They were just told point blank, we have no positions available, and the women would leave. I eventually was interviewed, and I was told that I would not be considered unless I came in with a slide projector. Don't worry, we'll find other tokens. Don't worry. I was invited to be in a wedding in Kennebunkport, Maine. I was the only non-white at the wedding. One of the friends of the family owned an old house that had been built in, I believe, the early 1800s. She wanted to invite all of the members of the wedding party to her home for lunch. That included the 5 bridesmaids and the 5 ushers. When we entered the house, she gave us a tour and finished the afternoon by giving us lunch. She seemed quite unnerved that I was a member of the wedding party, and had her place changed from another table to my table where she could sit and watch me eat. At the end of the afternoon, as we were leaving, the men stood on one side of the door and the women stood on another side of the door. She shook hands with all of the white women, skipped over me, shook hands with all of the white men, and then came to me last. You really must be paranoid. Your art really isn't political either. You know, I hear your experiences and I think, well, it's got to be in our art. That's the only way we'll validate you, and it's got to be in your art in the way that we consider valid. If it isn't used in a way, if your symbols aren't used in a way that we use them, then we won't acknowledge them. In fact, you won't exist until we validate you. And, you know, if you don't want to do what we tell you to do, then we'll find other tokens. After the wedding ceremony, there was a party held for the bride and groom and for the members of the wedding and the guest. They had a live band dancing. Of course, no one asked me to dance until near the end of the party, the minister, who was a man in his mid-60s, he came over to me, winked, ask me to dance, and then whispered into my ear, "I come to New York often. Why don't we get together? We can have some fun." You ungrateful little, after all we've done for you. You know, we don't believe in your symbols. You must use our symbols. They're not valid unless we validate them. And you really must be paranoid. I've never had an experience like that, but then of course I'm free, white, and 21.
It was very hard to watch that. I haven't seen it in its entirety for a couple of years.
Howardena, first of all, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And thank you for allowing us to watch it with you.
Yeah, it was pretty emotional. I mean, for me to feel that after 1980, you know, wow. Yep.
Before we talk about the film, maybe to give ourselves, all of us, a bit of a time to reflect, I want to talk about something that I've just learned about you.
Uh-oh.
I know. It could be big. You have a relationship with the Yale Center for British Art.
Yes, in fact, I wanted to start off by thanking Jules Prown. Professor Prown was my teacher, was my professor. I had really art history as my minor, and he and Graham Hood invited me to work in the Garvin collection. This was in between 65 and 67, and Graham Hood was the one who was pushing me towards museum work. And he recommended me for a Ford Foundation grant for museum studies, and they turned me down because they said I was an artist. And it's such an irony that I would end up at the Modern, after all of that. But I really, really appreciate Jules Brown and Graham Hood for what they did. In fact, it's kind of an amazing feeling to be here. And I think of the times when I came here, and I did nothing important, believe me, but just the fact that I'm back here, it's kind of an amazing feeling.
In general, how would you describe Yale? You leave the MFA program in 1967. You'd entered in 65. You came here, I assume, knowing that you would be a painter because you were entered into the painting program. What was it like? I imagine all of the sort of art history that we know of that period, the idea of a place that is so imbued with a kind of classical training. Was that true for you?
Okay, Boston U was a very, very, very traditional program, and color was not an issue. We called it the brown sauce school. And I learned to be a figurative painter, and I started when I was 8 years old in terms of drawing. So my drawing skills were kind of ahead of my time in a way. How can I explain it? Coming here to Yale, well, my teachers at BU stopped talking to me because they knew I would no longer be a figurative painter. And when I got a distinguished award, actually from Boston U, none of them would show up. But anyway, I was exposed here to Al Held, Hard Edge, abstract expressionism, a little bit of pop art. Judy Bernstein, who you might remember from Harry Screws, she was one of my classmates. And it was very different. The campus feels very different. It was before women were admitted as undergraduates. There were a few graduate women. There were very, very, very few black people. I don't even know if I saw any Asian people at all. It was kind of a strange environment where you were both petted in a way as a pet, or for example, in one of my classes, I think it was Robert Rosenblum, art history, I remember his saying to the students, "Gentleman and lady." I was the only woman in the class, so you would get that. Then you had trouble finding a bathroom. And then, it's not funny now because of the Trump era, okay? But during that time, the undergraduate men called the graduate dorm of women, Helen Hadley Hall, which may or may not still exist, they called us the Bay of Pigs. Anyway, now it's not a good laugh now. But anyway, it was very preppy. A number of the students had a lot of wealth. It was very obvious. And I remember there were secret societies. I mean, we didn't drive around much today, but I remember this sort of building that had no windows and whatever. But the school then was the art and architecture school. And what was nice, I think, all of us were in the same building. So you had artists who were sculptors, printmakers, painters, graphic designers. It's where I learned how to develop film. We had a photography. And then the architects interacted with us. We had the same classes, and some of the same classes. And one of the most important classes was Joseph Alber's class, color theory class. He had fought with Yale and left, but his protege, Cy Silman, taught the class. And for me, that was a really fundamental course which guided my use of color over the years. And I teach it also to my students, but I teach them using a different method. Because color aid paper now is ridiculously expensive. So, I can't burden them with that. But anyway, it was a very different environment. It was a kind of environment where if you had friendships with some of the whites, and it was like Parents' Week or something, they would cross the street so they wouldn't have to introduce you to their parents. Or if you were friendly, well, yeah, I mean, that says everything. So there was this sort of a hint of racism within the minds of the students. And yet, I remember there was one person who was Australian. He was in the law school. He couldn't have been more respectful. He was wonderful. But we were kind of treated, like pets or unusual people, being women on this campus. I don't remember. Oh, to give you an example, I remember I took different jobs, and I was, here at the Garden for some time, and then I was a telephone operator in the dorm. And because my patois is not necessarily black, I remember this young man with Cole, and he liked the sound of my voice, and he came over to meet me, and he was like, Anyway, so you would run into experiences like that. But I learned a lot. And I met a lot of really nice people. And Bernard Chait was my advisor. He was very helpful. And it was so supportive that, I liked the link with architecture and the link with sculpture. We were all in the same place. And having it spread out, I don't know, that makes me kind of sad, because it really works so well as one kind of entity.
Sorry.
As one entity.
One of the reasons that I thought the idea of putting free and painting together in the title for today's presentation was that you were not the first person to tell me that their experience of coming to Yale in the 1960s as an MFA student compared to their BFA experiences was one where figuration could be transitioned away from, perhaps maybe not seamlessly, but with some ease. Whereas the conversation around figuration, I've heard this from people who had attended Pratt. I've heard this from people who come from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. Was it actually a freeing experience to come here and be able to even say abstraction openly or to explore it? Did you feel supported?
Absolutely. All I can remember about Boston was Monet's haystacks. That's all I can remember. Anyway, the transition was a slow one, and I think that the doorway for me was color, because you had your little color square or rectangle in the circle, and then you had maybe a complementary color next to it. And so I was like looking at abstract. It was an abstract image, when I learned about color. It's hard to explain, because the transition came where I was trying to do my best, because some of my paintings were really corny as I was making that transition. And I think one of the things that influenced the work, I've never even mentioned this to anyone before, I just thought of it, was I started using skeletons. And I think that came about because it was during the Vietnam War, and I would go to New York to march in the anti-Vietnam marches. And I realized, and this piece is actually in my traveling show, I knew someone in the med school, and he was able to get me a real skeleton. The skeletons I use now are plastic. But I had this companion, a skeleton, in my studio. And I did an upside-down skeleton in orange. And it just hit me, Agent Orange. It's not, I don't even use orange that much anymore. But here I have this skeleton that's kind of like purplish background, and then the orange skeleton. I realized this was my statement about Agent Orange. And that was a very abstracted painting compared to the tight Boston University kind of sort of semi-realism, not photorealism, but realism.
There's so much made, I think, over the video, Free, White, and 21. One of the things that I find missing from that discussion, however, is a conversation about what it actually looks like and what you are representing in that film. And it is color that, in fact, and I mean this in terms of not so much you talking about race in the sense of color, but I mean actually the color that is happening with the garments that you're wearing, but also the background.
Well, my mother would send me these boxes, and if I mentioned the Modern and Mrs. Rockefeller, she would send me boxes of clothes. Now, the reason why she did that is my salary at the Modern was very small. I was making my own clothes, or buying really cheap clothes, and so my mother felt sorry for me, so she would send these clothes. I hated them, I just was like, I don't want to wear this. But I used the clothing for the film. And then I bought...
So you were using it.
Yeah. I did use it. I used it well, but I really should have given them to Goodwill. I wouldn't wear them. And then the backdrops were just photo paper backdrops. And I was living at the time in a very large loft, about 2,300 square feet for only $125 a month, including heat. Those
What
days
street
are
were you on?
gone. 28th Street, right at the subway stop, and 7th Avenue. It was a square loft, which was a great kind of shape, and was right across the street from FIT.
Wow.
And I was there for about 10 years. Then I moved to a loft in Soho. I hated Soho. Ugh. Anyway, on Broome and Broadway, which was really a much smaller space.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I moved because I got my landlord, who was a video artist, priced me out. I mean, he raised the rent $200 every year. So by 1987, it was $2,000. Anyway, so my parents helped me, thank God, finance an apartment where I have been now for almost 30 years in Upper Manhattan. So I say to artists, you don't have to have one of those big lofts, because that was just an era. That was just a time. It's like real estate in New York is like, out the roof. Some people live in Queens, whatever. But that you can live in an apartment and you can function in an apartment, although your neighbors will wonder what's wrong with you, because when you open the door, they're not going to see furniture, I mean, it's just, my apartment is like a loft and a storage area. And I have friends who understand me, who are not going to report me to the buildings department.
But Howardena, during the 70s, you made large-scale paintings. Could you have done that without being in a larger place, in a larger domestic place?
Well, the thing is, my ceilings now are about 10 feet high, and the ceilings in the loft were 13.
Okay.
So, and then when I lived at Westbeth, I forgot about that. I did large paintings there in a shared studio. I was one of the first residents of Westbeth, but the people who were single were often put in apartments that were too small for a studio. So what they did was use the building next door, and they gave us this sort of rickety falling down space with chicken wire, the whole bit. But it still was big enough. So I made paintings that maybe were about 12 feet by, 9, 10 feet, whatever. But I didn't stretch them. I liked hanging them loose. Now I don't mind them being stretched, because I wouldn't. What influenced me was African art and textiles. And for the modern, Lowry Sims, who was at the Met, curator in 20th century, and I was sponsored by the International Council of the Modern. We traveled through Africa for a month and a half. And so we saw, of course, a number of textiles. We went to Kumasi and we saw them weaving kente. And I liked the way the material moves. Mm-hmm. Now I don't use the stretcher. I mean, my things are kind of weird, sewn and whatever. And I like that. I like addressing the flatness of the wall with the kind of dimension of the painting.
Just to give a note to the students in the room, Lowry Sims, an amazing curator and former museum director, was the first Black American curator at the Metropolitan Museum. And then she later became one of the directors of the Studio Museum in Harlem. And so an incredibly important person, I think, not only in your career, but ushering in really a generation of artists, many of them abstract, interestingly enough, not only through the museum world in New York, but also internationally. And as you said, that was her first trip to Africa as well.
Yeah.
So really, I think making the connection for many artists, black and white, between what was happening in New York in terms of the hated Soho, but also what was happening in parts of Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very important trip for me. I think even more important now, I don't know how many of you have tried to get your DNA done. It's worth it. However, you have to be careful because of privacy issues. This is what I've been hearing lately. But when Lowry and I went to Africa, our first stop was Nairobi, and we got tickets. Well, first we flew to London, then we got tickets on East African Airlines, which has the highest accident rate, so I found out later. Well, Idi Amin had just released the Peace Corps people, and our flight was supposed to go from London to Nairobi. Well, we found we were going from London to Rome to pick up Idi Amin's diplomats. And then we had to go to Entebbe, where the Peace Corps people had, I guess they were allowed to leave. And we were sitting on the plane. It was like, oh my God, what's going to happen to us? The thing that struck me the hardest was the earth was red. I've never seen anything like that. Well, the irony is I had my DNA done through National Geographic. What they do is they go back through your matrilineal or whatever line back to your mother's first ancestor. The first place I landed was Uganda, my DNA 80,000 years ago, my mother, Uganda.
Wow.
So there are all these weird kind of things, like finding out that I have Zulu. I have a lot of Zulu DNA, and I have been to South Africa, and I remember someone came up to me and just looked at me and said, "Welcome home." And I almost started crying, but I didn't know. And also Cape Town was very prominent in my DNA. But also there was Portuguese, Basque, Scandinavia, Inuit, i.e. Eskimo. How did that happen? How did that happen? Let's see, I had, I think Germany, Scandinavia, Finland, Thracian, something like that. Anyway, it's a long list, and this one particular company gives you percentages so you know just how much you have of each thing. And they didn't even pick up on Uganda. That was surprising. But maybe 80,000 years ago is a little bit, a long time ago.
Wow. Do you, looking back at the film now, are there things that stand out to you? I wonder, the first time that I saw the film, I was an undergraduate. And I remember being told in the context of watching it that, first of all, it wasn't a film and that it was video. And I remember thinking, well, what's the difference between film? I didn't understand that just yet.
Yeah.
And so having to be told that difference was important because it did affect the method of delivery, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing that I thought was very interesting is that there is another film from 1963 that is also entitled Free, White, and 21. Was that an influence on you?
I think it was just the comment, "Oh, I'm free, white, and 21." I mean, that kind of casual comment. I don't think I really saw that film, but it was something that remained in my mind as a phrase. It just stuck in my head. And I think part of it, too, the film was motivated by annoyance with the women's movement, the white women's movement. Without them, I would not have had shows as early as I did. But when I would start to talk about racial stuff, they basically would say, "That's political, we don't want to talk about it." They wanted the black women to join them, and when the black women had an issue, they didn't want to join them. So I just became kind of irritated, annoyed by it. Also, one thing that was hard was very often a black woman would have to work, whereas a white woman who would have a husband who would support her, there were things that she could do that I couldn't do, or other black women couldn't do. And I remember there was a picket line in front of the Modern, and one of the women called me up and said, "Howardena, you have to come down here and march with us." And I said, "No, I don't want to lose my job. I'm the only breadwinner." And there was always like an annoyance that I wouldn't go along. Even the Guerrilla Girls, it took them some time before they started including racial issues in their posters, because they were really seeing it from what I remember a young Asian woman artist called it imperial feminism. That it was like, I don't know, that they were the center of the world and everyone else has to come along and agree.
I want to just contextualize, because you've given us perhaps at least 60 years of art history in just a few sentences.
Oh my God.
So I want to just to unpack it ever so slightly. It's also, I really want to be taking notes right now and not, engaging with you. You, first of all, one of the reasons perhaps that you couldn't have come down to join the picket line at the Museum of Modern Art is because you were also working there as a curator.
Yes.
So you were upstairs while the picket was
upstairs.
going on, and actually working upstairs while the picket was going on downstairs.
Yeah.
So that would have been quite difficult.
Well, there were a number of picket lines that were in front of the Modern. I laugh because we started a union. I was part of the group that started a union. So we were on the picket line twice before I decided enough, I want to teach. Anyway, and being on the ticket, I can't remember. Anyway, being on the picket line as an employee really was an interesting position to be in.
You were employed from the Modern from 1967 to 1979.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was an interesting position to be in because, like, the first time, it almost became violent. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the curators, I can't remember, Pierre Aproxime, I think was his name. He was in painting and sculpture, and he threw something at a truck, and they fired him. So they were basically, they were not tolerant of any kind of, physical stuff. And when we saw other picket lines, for instance, there was the first picket line I saw was really a first picketed person, had a blue question mark on plexi as a sign. It was maybe about this big. And he just walked in front of the museum asking the question, what is this institution? What is your purpose? And then there came the Art Workers Coalition that was headed by Carl Andre and Hans Hake. I would go to meetings, but I would get stared at because I worked at a museum. It's like, we don't trust you. But they had a number of picket lines, and plus they published a document, which probably is in the Museum of Modern Art Library now. And there was and there were other picket lines that formed after I left. And apparently there was a recent strike that was just settled. So, when I started the Modern, Renee Donicourt was still alive. $5,000 a year was your salary. And you would get a lovely note that gave you a $5 raise after 2 years. They were more integrated when I first started. There was a Native American curator of architecture. The head of personnel was Asian. Trying to think, I was there, and I'm trying to think who else. Of course, that's like a handful. And of course, many of the guards were of color, and the kitchen, definitely Latino, or a mix. So you didn't even see that many people of color, even in the galleries. It was almost like, it was like a blind spot. They had a blind spot, but then they did the Children's Art Carnival in Harlem. So I guess they felt they had their little outreach, but eventually the pressure became so great on them that they had to form what they called the Buyers Committee, which was run by a hyper-preppy, because they wouldn't let, I think his name was Wilder Green, something like that. It was an African-American fellow from Washington who was really the chairman, but they wouldn't let him be the chairman. It had to be a white head of it. And then many different, like the Children's Art Carnival, some of the curators, I kind of fought them because they didn't originally have me on the committee, but I said, yes, I want to be on this committee. And out of that came a show of Richard Hunt's work, I believe, and Bearden. And then after that, it was like, oh, well, that's done, And then everything went back to normal. Normal.
You're one of your colleagues who was junior to you at the time, when you were at MoMA, but who is now a very important museum person, said to me in conversation the other day, she said that you are the only person that she knows who has successfully been both an artist and a curator simultaneously.
I don't know how I did it, frankly.
How did you do it?
Well, I think because I had art history as my minor. It was because I was introduced to museums very, 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 very young. Someone told a member of my family that there was a mummy in the Egyptian collection at the Philadelphia Museum. It was a Fayum mummy that looked just like me. So I was sort of picked up and dragged to the museum. And I love Egyptian art. I've been to Egypt. I've climbed in the pyramids. I've been in Tut's tomb. I'm an Egyptiophile, although I hear some of the guards are giving away some of the artifacts. But anyway, and what the main thing I think that influenced me, and it's hard to believe a child would understand, Marcel Duchamp. They have a huge, wonderful Marcel Duchamp collection. And it turned my head around. So when I was just being a figurative artist, in my own way, in the back of my head, I had Marcel Duchamp's work. And the Bride Strip Bear was one of my favorite pieces. And then there was a little piece that was like a cage, and it had sugar cubes in it that I think were marble. And I think it was either Why Sneeze or Please Sneeze, something like that. So that I had this link with museums, and I loved going to museums. And my parents were told by one of the teachers when I was in third grade, that I had a lot of talent as an artist, and that they must take me to museums, to visit artists, and to galleries. Well, Philadelphia and galleries is a little loose. There weren't many. But I was introduced to both black and white artists. So when I came to the art world and found how segregated it was, I was really shocked. Because in Philadelphia, there was, I think the fellow that they introduced me to, his name was Benton Spruance. And he was, I think, a teacher at Beaver College in Pennsylvania.
Wow. Did it, all of those years at the Modern, you're in the Prints and Drawings department, or what's now Prints and Drawings.
Yeah.
Did you see yourself, did you feel like you had a different kind of understanding of the work because you actually understood how it was made?
Yes.
Do you think that that's part of what made you so successful as a curator?
I think it has something to do with the training of the eye, because I could see, I don't know how to explain it. My eye was trained just by being an artist. I could see what I felt was strong and what I felt wasn't strong in terms of artistic production. My department head was a printmaker, and we would disagree. I mean, our eyes were very different, even though she was an artist. She knew how to make things, but she had given it up. And it's something that I wouldn't give up. So I was interacting not only in the studio with myself and then, colleagues, other artists, whatever, but I was also interacting and going into the galleries on days when the public would not be there. I would go and wander all around to see, without a whole crowd.
You can't do it now. There's
Really?
never a day that the Modern is not closed.
Oh well.
It's horrible.
Oh well. But that, it was like I was in a library as a scholar. It was a visual library. And so it fed my work, but fortunately, through the help of the editing department, I learned to really write better. And then I started to have an opinion. Because what I found was, and this had to do with my shock that the art world was so segregated, I was on New York State Council committees where I saw that the Metropolitan Museum and some of the alternative spaces had line item funding, i.e. they didn't have to fight for it, it was just theirs. But as soon as an institution of color, an alternative space like the Asian American Cultural Center or a studio museum, whatever, they had to jump through all of these hoops. And I thought, that really isn't quite right. And after a while, I got really pissed off, and I started to write about it. So in 1987, at that point, I had left the Modern. I left in 79. In 1987, I published a paper which was given at I think it was a Hispanic conference, and I just made it a fatter paper, and I sent it out, and it's, I believe, published. Brooklyn Museum published it in We Wanted a Revolution. They published the whole thing, and I'm very grateful because I thought it was lost forever. So I started to express myself more in writing, in a way. And I can't say I stopped painting. I didn't stop painting, but somehow the two balanced out. And in a way, it's like I do work that is issue-related that started really after I was in that bad car accident. But then it was like my writing was issue related, and I would do the abstraction to chill out. I really don't know. I mean, it just worked out that way, and I think it really, the main key was that Fayum mummy that got me into the museum, because then my eyes were looking all over, and I was seeing the museum as a place for visual research, even though I was a little kid.
I'm hung up on this idea that there's a transition for you. And maybe this is because I'm not an artist, and as an art historian, I'm always looking for a reason for something. And so I wondered to myself, I know that you had made sculpture earlier in your career, and I know that you had also worked with objects in a way that informed your painting. So infamously, many of your paintings are made by, punctuating paper to then make the scraps from the paper become a part of the painting. But so 1979, you leave the Museum of Modern Art, you move to the State University of New York at Stony Brook.
I'm still in Manhattan.
You're still in Manhattan?
I do the.
Okay, so you never move out to Stony Brook?
Yeah.
Good choice.
Oh, God. Oh.
And then but you also then, so within the space of 12 months, you've then made this video. I assume that you're
It was
also...
after the accident.
After the accident.
That's why I wrapped my head,
Okay.
I think.
I
That's
see.
the key there.
Is there something that you're looking for? Because both before and after 80, you will return to painting. I mean, you're a painter after you made that early sculpture, and then you're a painter later. And is there something that goes on? Did you need to work out something in terms of the professional shift as well as a material shift?
I don't know. I mean, I think I have something here. I'll explain it. For me, I think once I left the modern, I started interrogating myself, and I found there were certain catalysts that sort of attracted me to, the real key for me was the circle, okay? And when I was here at Yale, there was another graduate student, Nancy Murata, who was playing around with the circle, and it was like, bingo, this was like catalyst. Well, what I realized, and it took time to realize it, was that when my father and I were traveling, my parents went to visit my mother's mother in Ohio, in southern Ohio. And so when she was with her sisters and her mom, my father and I drove down to northern Kentucky, and that was during segregation. And I always tell people that I was frightened by a circle, and the reason why I carry this around, because that's exactly what it was this. We went to a root beer place, and the fellow brought out the same chilled mugs, the same amount of root beer, but at the bottom of each mug was this red circle. That was painted, no doubt, by an artist, but anyway. And it scared me, and I said to my father, "What is this?" And he said, African Americans can only use utensils, dishware, and so forth that has the circle. If you're white, there's no circle. Okay, so I consider that being terrified by a circle. This is a sticker, which I'm sure they didn't have then. It was most likely painted. And that kind of was the thing that started this, almost like a loop, where I would punch out the circles. And now circles I can punch out circles this big now.
Wow.
Yeah, over the years, the circle, the utensils you use or the instruments you use have changed. And you can go to Michael's, I don't know if you have a Michael's here, and buy all different size hole punches. They even have hole punches that look like birds and whatever. But anyway, so I carry this around. A reminder.
I don't want to, I could keep asking you questions all evening. I really could. But I think that maybe there are many that would come from the audience. Please, if you're interested or have a question.
Well, I'm interested, since you mentioned...
May I ask you just to wait for the microphone? Only. Yeah.
You can read down here. Gee.
You raise your hand, please, so I can see you.
Hi. So you mentioned appreciating hanging a painting without stretching it, and I'm curious to learn why that choice, because I like that idea. Why did you decide to hang your works of art without a frame?
Because I like the irregular shape, and I like that, in fact, there's a yellow painting for that museum show that's traveling around. There's a really beautiful catalog, thanks to my dealer, who's right here. It's an amazing Garth Greenan. He's incredible. He really is. I gave him an Olympic medal. I had one made for him. Anyway, ask me again, because I'm old.
Yeah, you mentioned that you used to hang your works of art?
Yes, African art, African textiles. There was an African textile show at the Modern, I think it was around 1973 or so. And 73 was the year that I went to Africa. And 74 is when I went to Africa again, but to Egypt. And then I went back again, but to South Africa when Mandela was president, to give a paper. It was the Johannesburg Biennale. But I like that free-formed cloth. And there's one painting that I did. I don't even know if I can replicate it. It looks like the whorls of a shell, and it hangs very strangely. But I love it because it's almost like sculptural, but it's not. It's high relief, but it's not. I just love the way it interacts with the room and with people, rather than framing everything, in the rectangle. For me, I don't want to be locked into the picture plane. I really like to see it free-flowing and interacting with everything around it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for your talk. Could you say a little bit about pests?
Pests?
Yeah, you were involved in
okay.
pests, and I think they preceded Guerrilla Girls.
After Guerrilla Girls, or during Guerrilla Girls. There's an archive for pests at the Modern, because Clive Philpott, who was very progressive, he was the head librarian, asked me to send him anything that I had. So there's a remnant of it that's available to the public. Well, pests was an interracial group, Latino, Asian, and Black. And it wasn't a huge group of people, but we put out posters like the Guerrilla Girls, and and we put out a newsletter also, which looked at the statistics of the different shows and so forth. But all of that's in the library, at the Modern. Some of the members were afraid to put up posters because they were afraid they'd be arrested. So there were some artists who don't want to be thought of as part of the group, who actually would go out at night with me and put up posters. Some who were, because they're so well known, they didn't, want to be associated because it might damage whatever. I remember because we had a P.O. box, we got a threatening letter from Anina Noise, who at the time her gallery was all white and all male. And we had a poster, one of the Asian members created this amazing poster of a very upscale dinner service, plates and everything, and it said at the top, "We serve whites only." And then listed down the side all the galleries that were all white. And her name was one of the galleries. So we got a letter threatening to sue us if she ever finds out who we are. So I decided at that point I would do an artwork from the material. And that's when I did the book, Art Crow, Jim Crow. And each page, like on one page, it's a black book, but it's painted with like silver white ink, and I use sort of vintage images. There's an outhouse, and it says on the front of it, "For real, whites only." And then there was like a picture of, I think it was a laundry that said "whites only," and then I had the list of all the galleries. And there's, I think the one that I thought was very interesting was Coca-Cola had segregated Coca-Cola machines, but they didn't have Coca-Cola machines for black people, they were Coca-Cola machines for white people. And you could get, it was like 5 cents white customers only. And the person who took the picture and then put it in a book was arrested for taking the picture. So, I guess Coca-Cola was afraid it would damage its image. This picture was photographed, I think it was photographed in the 1950s. So that's one of the images in the book.
That would have been important, though, because it goes back to what you said, though, about the marking of the root beer glass.
Yeah.
Because perhaps one of the reasons it's not just the machine is for whites only, it's that those bottles, the old glass Coca-Cola bottles, were actually recycled and reused by the distribution plants. So it would have meant that they were saying that those bottles were only ever used by white customers.
Interesting.
To then be resold only to other white customers.
Interesting. Yeah.
And
Good
that seems
point.
impossible, actually.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well,
There's a question
there's a
here, but I
question.
want to just interject one more thing that you said, or just to put more, because you keep giving us so much great art history. Anina Nose will also be one of the first galleries to profit from and really popularize Basquiat.
Basquiat.
Yeah.
Yep.
People change.
Yeah. People change, but...
Thank you. Hi, I'm a second-year gallery guide at the Yale Art Gallery, and I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background on the works you have that are exhibited in the Contemporary Gallery in the UAG, and perhaps what you would want visitors to the museum to take away from those, if possible.
I think the best reference book is the catalog for the traveling show. And I really don't like to tell people what they should take from the images. I heard about a child who saw the show in Chicago, and she saw it 3 times, and she cried when she heard the show was coming down. The work touches people in many different ways. I mean, I was surprised by how touched I was by this tape, because I haven't really looked at it for a long time, although it's had a lot of legs. It's been around. So I don't think I can tell people what they can take from it. I don't want to dictate that. Did I misunderstand the question?
No, I was interested by your inspiration. What fueled you to create those works?
I don't know. I don't know. I just make them, you know. I guess because I'm not married, they're my children? I don't know. Oh, well, you'll love this. Whenever I got a marriage proposal, the deal was you have to give up your art or else. In fact, one person said, "Who do you think you are, Picasso?" I mentioned that to a friend of mine. She said, "Say yes, yes."
Thanks. Hi. So, I guess you had just mentioned Basquiat, and I was watching a film recently, and that had me thinking about, like, near the end, how he sort of fizzled as a result of, like, how he was being tokenized, you know, in all of the interviews and write-ups about his work, constantly referring to his work as primitive, and, you know, those are always code words. So, and then in your video, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the idea of symbols and what symbols are respected, what symbols are validated, how Black art or art by Black people sometimes feels like it needs to fit within a certain constraint to be recognized by certain institutions. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a complex question. Part of it is most of the mainstream art institutions don't have any staff of color unless they are guards or in the kitchen. And so there's no real dialogue that questions what they're doing. And if there's a dialogue, often there's hostility because they don't want to know. I have a perfect example. There's a very dear friend of mine who was one of the curators at the Textile Museum. And there was a job opening, and there was a young woman who was African American with amazing qualifications, and a young woman who was white who had minimal references and qualifications. They took the white woman. And my friend Camille said, you know, why did you do that? The other woman was far more qualified. And they said, oh, we were comfortable with her. So in other words, I think the reason why things are so frozen is the comfort zone. You know, that there is I had a young woman come to me in tears. She was working for a New York City cultural organization, and the white women tormented her and made fun of her. And she was beautiful. I think they were just jealous. She was gorgeous. And they did not want her to stay there. And she eventually left. You know, so the environment of the arts, in fact, the person who was one of our, what do you call it? affirmative action people. She was a young woman, Latino, and she said she's worked in many universities around the country, and the most resistant department of all the departments to have integrate their staff are the art departments. They do not want to have an integrated staff. I had given a presentation at a panel in Texas, and I remember, if you know the artist Sam Gilliam, his ex-wife was a reporter for the Washington Post. So we were just having lunch, and a white woman, I had just been on a panel where I talked about, the way things are not diverse and so forth. And a young white woman came over to us and very kind of haughtily said, we don't welcome black students, they're gonna take our jobs. And then there was an intern in the museum. She was half German and half Indian, but she looked more Indian. And she was sent to some very, very haughty kind of private schools. And I remember she came up to me very sort of haughty, and she said, well, we don't want them there. We just drive them away. So, I mean, this attitude within the cultural industry is so frozen in kind of a white supremacist dialogue and so scared. Although there's one thing, when Obama won, things started to change. You started to see more shift and, just cautious shift. And with Trump, it's weird because thank God he's not interested in culture, because you can imagine what he'd do to us, okay? However, there are people who were in, say, the Republican side, who started to sort of wiggle over to the Democratic side and started to see, I'm not a racist like that. I don't accept that. And so they may be starting to sponsor some diverse projects. I mean, I see that as sort of something that's happening kind of under all of it. But again, I'm grateful he's not cultured enough or whatever to really concern himself with what we're doing. Because he could cause a big problem in terms of funding things that are really horrible. Anyway, I mean, thank God he's not interested.
I think that's probably a wonderful place for us to end. Before we close, and before I invite you all to join Howardena at the reception outside, I would like to thank Miko McGinty and Nicholas Roman Lewis from the Yale Art Alumni League. Amy Myers, of course, and the entire staff of the Yale Center for British Art, the Afro-American Cultural Center at Yale, and the Yale University Art Gallery for bringing Howardena here. I think this has been a wonderful evening to hear from her. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. If you're shy, you can ask me at the reception. If you're shy about asking a question, I don't bite yet.